Now I wait for you to sentence me. Must I go or must I stay? Will my skies be blue or gray? Are my dreams to be or not to be?
I'm Amy Colbert. I'm a translator of a book that's forthcoming. It's called Lili Elba's Confessions, and it was published originally in 1931, but it's had a long history. First, the book was published in Danish. Then it was translated and adapted and with changes in German. After that, it was translated into English in 1933. And that's the version that most people know nowadays. Now, after that, it was turned into a novel by David Ebershoff in 2000, the year 2000. And it has, after 15 years, been made into a movie. And so what I've done is go down to the bottom of the pile, pull that original version out, translate it into English, and let the reader know what Lili Elba's actual words were. We need to let her speak for herself. We need to let trans people speak for themselves and not always be speaking through some sort of interpreter. As I said, The Danish Girl has been turned into a movie that's just recently come out. A very fine movie, actually, I might add, which goes to a good extent behind the novel itself and even behind the English translation, and goes back to the Danish translation itself in some respects. So this is what I think we're now hungry for, getting the real story out and finding out what's really going on instead of trying to interpret it in terms of our closed categories of male, female, heterosexual, homosexual. And so, oh, there's a third category, transgender, it's now called. Now back then, it didn't have a name. And so she had what she calls her sex change operation, this term that was also used in Christine Jorgensen's day. What she had to go through and what we have today. She was an absolute pioneer. She is the very first, not the first to get these surgeries, she's about the third or fourth, but the first to actually write anything about it, the first to become public in any way whatsoever. So she had nothing to read about. She had no mentors. There were no peer support groups. The only help she had was that of her artist wife, who stood by her through all this, but was no doubt as perplexed as she was by what was going on. She envisaged it as two persons occupying the same body. And that's the only way she could get her head around it. Now we know that's not, well, it's to some degree true, but only it's a half-truth. So today we have a large bibliography on the subject. A great many books have been written about it. People are coming around to understanding it on its own right, rather than trying to interpret it as something else. The novel, David Eberhoff's The Danish Girl, tries to interpret it as a form of homosexuality. However, the movie very wisely went beyond that, or below that, however we want to think of it, and interpreted what she was doing as gender identity, which is a different thing from sexual orientation altogether. So when one thing they said in the movie was that she, if I can paraphrase it sort of, is that she was born a woman and the doctor has just helped her feel more like a woman. That's what's going on. Much better than changing her from a man to a woman, because she never really was a man. Lili and her wife, Gerda, or his wife, I guess it was at the time, moved to Paris in 1912. And that was just at the start of the time when modernism became prominent, began breaking through. People like Picasso and Stravinsky, Gertrude Stein, and the rest, Diaghilev in ballet. And it was a very open time where experimentation and freedom of expression were appreciated. And of course, that's why they moved there. So she was able to cross-dress for years, from 1908 until she transitioned in 1930. That's 22 years. She cross-dressed, as so many do today. And she, being transsexual, got away with it. In fact, she cross-dressed so convincingly that when she was dressed as a man, people often took her for a butch woman and thought she was trying to fool them. So she would cross-dress quite freely, got several proposals for marriage as a woman, and had a ball with it. Now, this is, I think, a freer atmosphere than we have today. Although much of that may simply be the fact that she was so convincing as a woman that it was easy for her to do. For myself, speaking for myself, as an older woman, you get away with a lot that a younger woman would not do. And I think that kind of dynamic would have been working for her. Nowadays, of course, there's still a lot of repression against men trying to impersonate women. Of course, we're not doing that at all. We're trying to impersonate ourselves. That's the person we're trying to get to. That female person that's been hiding all these years inside. And Lili had that same thing. Gradually, as she cross-dressed, she became more and more used to the role. And she would be, well, the word back then is gay, not meaning what it means today. She would be very open, and she'd be herself when she was cross-dressed. But when she went back to her old self, she'd be more repressed. And this eventually showed up, for instance, in both her voice and her handwriting, which, when she did transition, people were surprised at the change, where, of course, she'd been practicing it for years. Now, as for conditions, today we have all the help of a large literature on the subject. We have peer support groups that you can go to. We have a lot of movies even you can go to, as for instance, The Danish Girl. And the doctors are much more open about the subject. She bashed her head against a brick wall trying to get a doctor to recognize what was wrong with her One of them even went so far as to say, well, what you need is radiation. And so apparently he radiated her genitals in order to make them more virile. That was the theory back then. Of course, it had the opposite effect and was probably contributing to the fact that she no longer could pass as a man as well. Now today, if you go to the doctor, most of them are more or less, oh, I know about this, but I really don't know what to do. I can't prescribe you this, I can't prescribe you that. So you have to go out and get that on your own, either by going to a specialist or find some other doctor who is knowledgeable on the subject. And generally the community knows who these people are. So you can get medical help. Back then, she searched and searched and searched, and finally, when her friends did find this German surgeon who was going to help her, she said, no, I'm not going to any more doctors. They'll just make a fool of me. But finally, she did get him, and he was the one who said, I know exactly what's wrong with you. You have surprisingly feminine forms. I can see here from your photos when this began taking effect. You're actually a woman. And you probably have ovaries. Now this was a surprise to her, as it would be to all of us, because in her case, she seems not only to have been intersexed, but to have actually been a true hermaphrodite, as it was called back then, someone with both male and female gonads. And when they did the surgery, the doctor reports having found withered ovaries. Now the current film, The Danish Girl, which has come out here in 2015, is supposedly taken from the novel by David Ebershoff. But in many ways, it goes back behind the novel to the original Danish version. They did a lot of research in Denmark, and you can see it in the film. The interiors look just like out of a painting of Wilhelm Hammershøi. Now, nobody else knows that name but me, but there it is. There are a number of things like that they go behind the novel to get at the reality that was there. Among other things, they use the actual names rather than the pseudonyms that are present in the books, including the novel by Ebershoff. As I said earlier, they do not attribute transgenderism to homosexuality, as the novel does. There is this one quote that I think they added, well, I know they added, that is not in the original book, but it epitomizes it very well. When Lili says, someone mentioned she was born a man, and she says, no, I was born a woman, and the surgeon has only helped me feel more like one. That's a paraphrase. It's something like that. And of course, that's what's going on here. And the movie has done the research to understand this. And so while there are historical inaccuracies in the movie, for instance, the action is very much shortened. So we have a unity of time in the movie that we didn't in real life. In real life, it took 22 years. In the movie, that's down to 4. And then the other thing I might quibble with the movie is the treatment of Lili's wife, Gerda, who was an artist, like Einar was. Einar Wegener, who Lili was before becoming Lili. her role is shown in the movie as more passive than I think it was. She pretty much created or midwifed Lili Force. The Einar Wegener and his wife Gerda, who were both artists, found that in around 1912 they were tired of the rather conservative attitudes in Denmark, which is still into the peasant era, when people were, painters particularly, were trying to paint peasants and potato eaters. And instead, they decided to go to Paris for artistic freedom, but it also gave them a certain personal freedom, so that Lili could cross-dress pretty much at will. There is a poem that was written in the Danish newspaper as they sent her off to Paris, that where the author says he is sorry to see them leave, but it's strange that he should have been taking pleasure in seeing Einar's being portrayed in Gerda's paintings. And so she was already using him as model, but there was a lot of gossip going on, and so they left for Paris, where she got some offers to exhibit. She became an extraordinarily prodigious artist. Did both paintings and illustrations. Bridged that gap between high art and low art, which was not usual in those days. Now, Gerda was no doubt bisexual. She married 2 men in her life, but she's also known as the illustrator for a series of rather risque lesbian paintings of women delectating one another in ways that many of us can imagine. And Lili, of course, had freedom to cross-dress whenever she wanted. Whenever she felt she needed a little lift, she would cross-dress, and often played spoofs on people. And they're all there in the book. She even, at one point, was back in Denmark and was having a meeting with her parents. But their parents were told, "Oh, Lili will be delayed, but we do have someone else here, a friend from Paris." And so she came in as this beautiful young Parisian and fooled her own parents. I've kind of identified with Lili in many ways, both in her married relationship, which was rather like mine, and in their gradual realization that she needed to transition. She had, at the end of it, she'd actually decided that she would commit suicide. And she gave herself a year to live. And 2 months before the year was up, she met the doctor who offered to do surgery for her. That saved her life. Or, as she's put it, saved the lives of both of them, Einar and Lili, from their common shipwreck. Well, there's a great difference between her life back then in the 20s and 30 and the life of trans people today on the medical and the social issues. But on the personal issues, the psychological issues, they are remarkably similar to what we find today. If you go to any group, any peer support group, you will find these same issues taken up. That there is a real trepidation about transition, understandably so, I think, and that people get almost paranoid about having to actually go through with this. And she had a lot of that. It comes through very well in the book, and it's criticized by a number of people who aren't in the know as being self-centered or being over the top. But it's in fact what actually happens. There is this condition we have as transgendered people called dysphoria, which means an unhappiness with the way we are and a desire to change that and to be a simple, whole person. She suffered from this to a considerable degree, and in the final years before transition, she was essentially dying. She was just in deep, deep depression and needed to get out of it. And of course, that's what the surgery did for her. Today, of course, it's a lot easier. We can pop some pills, for instance, to get some hormones. She had to go to a surgeon and have ovaries transplanted in her abdomen. And she would have liked to have had a uterus transplanted there. And it's often brooded about. People suppose that that was the final operation from which she died, that the doctors were implanting a uterus. I think that's not only very unlikely that they would ever even try that at that period. It's a huge organ. She actually rejected the first set of ovaries she got, so they had to transplant those. So it wasn't a minor thing. What she seems to have died from was a kidney disease that she'd had for some time. And during the fourth operation that she had to construct a vagina, her kidneys started acting up, or her bladder. We don't know which, but it sounds very much like she had a suprapubic catheter for drainage from the bladder. And it was reported after her death that she had a tumor, a large tumor. And it's quite possibly that which killed her, and not the surgery itself. The doctor had given a lecture on constructing a neovagina preparatory to transplanting a uterus in a woman. But I think the stress here is preparatory to it. He was only planning that first stage, and that's all he was able to do at that time. And then she actually died from this bladder tumor that she had been going about with gradually. Now, I don't know whether radiation would have caused or prevented that, but that's a factor there. We don't know. This was in the clinic, the municipal women's clinic in Dresden, which was thoroughly bombed by the Allies in 1945, and all the records are gone. And so we can only guess from what people can remember and hints here and there. So we don't know, but that was why she died. Very sad, of course, as any death is. But in her case, it had nothing to do, I don't think it had anything to do with the surgery itself, which was going forward to give her that final mark of femininity, the vagina. And it was in those days normal to do the surgery precisely in 2 different surgeries, as it often is still today. And back then, they didn't have the terms transsexual or transgender, which are rather more modern terms, but they used simply to speak of someone who changed their sex. And so we have a sex change operation being spoken of, as it was in the case of Christine Jorgensen. And they thought of these people pretty much as hermaphrodites. And of course, she was intersex, so that does fit that. She was perhaps a true hermaphrodite. So she would fit that definition, but of course, she was different from the average transvestite of the age. They did have the word transvestite that had been coined by Magnus Hirschfeld in 1910, but not everyone knew it or used it. Basically, they just thought of it as going from man to woman, which is the title of her book when it was published, although she called it her Confessions. It was redubbed from man to woman, and in English, man into woman. This was a mystery for most people, as it was, as I recall from my childhood, with Christine Jorgensen. People just didn't understand how this could happen or what was going on. And she lived in that era and feared becoming what she called a phenomenon, which is someone who is remarkable. Today we might even call it a celebrity, which everyone wants to be, except, of course, people who are actually celebrities find that it's not that comfortable. She wanted to just be an ordinary woman, and that's what she thought of herself as. She thought of herself as surviving that other person, Einar Wegener, who she often spoke of as her late brother. She recalled her childhood, for instance. She mentioned certain things that indicated to her that she was in fact born a woman. And one of them, and it's a minor incident, she would push her sister's baby carriage, like to push the sister's baby carriage. Now, that's a fairly normal thing, I suppose, and it isn't something to get you labeled as a fairy, except she feared she'd be labeled as a fairy. She also remembered the incident years later. And so this is this submerged recognition of one's trans identity, which comes forth years later. In my own case, I remember volunteering to play the female role in the school play. And that seemed to me perfectly natural. After all, it's a play, and so why not do it? But the point isn't that any child might have done that at that age, and it's a fairly normal thing. But the point is, years later, that's what I remember. And she has that same history to her, that she remembers these incidences where she was trying to explore herself as a girl, and yet was often beaten for it and repressed it. And that repression, of course, is what keeps that realization under wraps for all those years. For her, she started cross-dressing at the age of 25. I took a lot longer. No, I started earlier. I actually started earlier, but I find that very similar. We should let Lili speak for herself and then decide whether it was she or the dualistic, patriarchic, and sexist culture in which she found herself in which we still find ourselves, that is in fact unnatural, inauthentic, and cloaked in pretensions.
C'est vite ce qu'on m'appelle, car je suis la plus belle. Tous les mannequins que j'ai faquins grâce à mon sourire coquin. Sur mon corps long et frais, des cosses grâce à un modèle. Tous les clients immédiatement le trouvent charmant.